if you're going to tell a story, you want to have something that moves the story forward. You see, if your story just sits there, nothing happens, it's boring. Nothing happens. If everything is fine and okay with your characters and your story, it's not going to work. The whole thing's going to fall apart. I mean, it's great that everything's wonderful for your characters, but there's really no reason to tell a story of everything's fine. It's like, everything's great. No problems. Well, that's not going to move that story forward. What that means is that you need to have some sort of conflict in your story. And that conflict needs to build. Maybe now you're wondering, Tim, gee, how do I put conflict in my story? How do I make sure that there's some sort of conflict going on that's really going to build, develop, and grow those characters? Well, that can be a challenge. Finding the right conflict that's going to work can be difficult. Because if you have the wrong conflict in there, it's just not going to fit together. It's not really going to happen. Basically, the story will sit there, won't go along, and the people listening to the story will say, it's not really going anywhere. Nothing's really happening. But if you have the right conflict, the conflict that really moves things, your audience starts thinking, oh, hey, something's going on. Something's happening. I better pay attention. Well, fortunately, there are some very basic conflicts that you can use. They're simple, they're powerful, and in using them, naturally, the conflict you set up leads to more conflict and more conflict. In fact, you can layer these conflicts on top of each other. We have one type of conflict, another type of conflict, and another type of conflict, and as these conflicts kind of layer on each other, they kind of fight against each other and creates even more conflict. And that really drives your story forward. And they're simple. Easy to understand, easy to implement. Once you get implementing, you'll discover that you start getting dialogue. You start getting a back and forth dialogue. Each conflict will create its own special type of dialogue, and that dialogue will really help move things forward. It'll really make the whole talk, the whole speech, the whole discussion come alive and be interesting, engaging, exciting, just by using that correct conflict. So today you're going to find out about 3 different types of conflict. 3. One conflict you probably are already aware of. You already know it, you're already familiar with it. In fact, maybe it's what you think a conflict basically is in a story. But there are some other types of conflict too. As you go past the obvious conflict into some of the different types of conflict, you'll start to understand how all these work separately, and also how they all can kind of work together. As you start becoming more familiar with this conflict and using this conflict, it'll become easier. And then your stories will go from, there's not much happening, to, whoa, some things are really happening here. And the stories don't need to be that complex or weird or strange or elaborate. You don't have to become a great novel writer just to create an interesting story, if you lay down the right conflict at the beginning. And different types of conflict will come out of the situation. It'll create different sort of stories. But each conflict will also add an interest and engagement, because stories, examples tell and stories sell. You want to sell the audience what you're talking about. It really helps to have some sort of story with that conflict. Now, it's not just that the conflict sit there. The conflict has to grow. The conflict has to develop. There has to be more conflict as the story goes on. And then eventually you resolve the conflict and get to the point of your story. But until then, it's really making that conflict work, really making that back and forth, that struggle come out in your stories, and therefore in your audience and in the minds of your audience. Your stories, after all, don't take place on the stage. They take place in the minds of your audience. So today you're going to learn about those 3 different types of conflict and help the minds of your audience open up to what you're saying. The first type of conflict is something you're probably already familiar with. You probably already know it, know a little bit about it. When you think about conflict, this is the sort of thing you think about. You think, oh yeah, conflict, okay, I know what that is. I know how that works. But even though it's a simple, basic sort of conflict, it's nevertheless a very powerful conflict. There's a reason why everybody's pretty much already aware of it. It's because it's so useful and so powerful to really get that story moving forward the way you want it to move. And it's a natural sort of a conflict. It happens so easily, so simply. When a simple little condition is held, you're going to have this type of conflict come out. And out of the conflict will come dialogue, the dialogue will come interest, and the interest will come that story being moving forward and something happening. And that first type of conflict is external conflict. External conflict. This is the sort of conflict that happens when there are two people, or two groups of people, that have opposite goals. Right now you might be thinking, Tim, well, isn't that what all conflict is? Two people, opposite goals? I mean, that's what conflict is. And then, of course, out of that will come dialogue. But that's conflict, right? Well, yes, as I mentioned, it's one type of conflict. There are some others. Let's take a look at this type of conflict right now. For instance, think about two groups with opposite goals like Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet. It's been done for many years in many different stages and many different styles and many different situations, but the story of it is very basic. A guy and his gal want to get together, and their parents are dead set against it. That's really the basic story. And it's a powerful story. So already you got a conflict. These people want to get together. These people want to prevent them from getting together. So you can imagine the sort of dialogue. Romeo saying to his dad, Dad, I really want to get together with Juliet. Dad says, no, Romeo, you can't do that. She's the wrong woman. So, well, Dad, I love her. Says, Son, I know you love her, but that's not enough. She's the wrong woman. You can't get together. We've been warring with these families for centuries, for years, for hundreds of years. You can't possibly get together with her. Well, that's a conflict. And because of that external conflict between these two different people, Romeo and his dad, or even Juliet and her family, or Juliet and Romeo's dad, this conflict, that moves the story forward. Then Romeo has to figure out what he wants to do. How does he get around it? How is he going to make this whole thing happen when his family is so dead set against it? And maneuvering around this problem, that moves the story forward. And that gets Romeo thinking, oh, okay, I can do this or I can do that. And that makes the story interesting. That type of external conflict. And of course, external conflict leads to that type of external dialogue. Or one character says something to the other character, and the other character says something to this character, says, hey, Dad, really want to get her with Juliet. Oh, Romeo, you can't do that. Why not, Dad? And back and forth they go. And that creates that conflict. So just by taking two people, just two people, to make it really simple, two people with opposite goals, where somebody wants something, and the other person doesn't want them to get it, or one person is striving for something, and the other person wants to get there first, this creates an external conflict between two people, or two groups of people, but in this case, just say two people, and that can drive a story forward. That can make a story interesting, engaging, people get it. They say, oh, okay, yeah, I understand. So this conflict between two people, and because it's so basic, because it's so simple, it's so simply understood, people get it and get involved with it. Because they can identify it. They can say, okay, yeah, I know what this is. I know how this works. And that's external conflict. A simple, powerful conflict you can use to get that challenges back and forth. But of course, external conflict is only one type of conflict. There are other types of conflict you can use too. And while external conflict talks about two people out there in the world, there's a different sort of conflict that's complete opposite. of external conflict. All right, you have your external conflict. You have that conflict going on between two people, back and forth, back and forth. And that's a pretty good conflict. Pretty basic conflict. And you can just use that, okay? They got people going back and forth, dialogue going back and forth, great external conflicts happen out there in the world between two people, fine, no problem. But if you want to get a little bit deeper, and make the audience get a little bit deeper in the story, you can add on to another type of conflict. And this is another type of conflict the audience can understand and identify with. But it's something people don't think about as much as a conflict, but it really is. And that is internal conflict. Internal conflict. Now, external conflict is all about two people out there in the world doing things. Internal conflict is about a person themselves who is warring with themselves. They have two opposite ideas they're trying to figure out. For instance, if, in the case of Romeo and Juliet, if Romeo thought that maybe his dad had a good point, and he thought maybe it's not the best thing to get together with Juliet after all, he could then be going back and forth. This is internal conflict. And that could lead to internal dialogue, again, going back and forth. Where on one hand, you might say, well, Juliet's so wonderful, I must be with her. And you might say, well, but my dad, I really don't want to get separated from my family. Yes, but Juliet's worth sacrificing everything for. Well, come on, I just met her. We're all both pretty young. We get older. This might be a big mistake. Come on, you're young. You can get things done now. Older life, you can regret later on in old life. Do something now. Yes, but if it's the wrong thing, it'll have consequences for many, many years. And back and forth it goes. Internal conflict. The thing about internal conflict and internal dialogue, it's important to go back and forth. Just with external conflict, is this back and forth dialogue between somebody wants something and another person doesn't want them to get it, or they're both striving the same thing. Internal conflict, you go back and forth between somebody wants to do something, but they're not exactly sure. And they go back and forth and try to figure out exactly what it is. Whereas an external conflict, it just has a dialogue back and forth. Internal conflict you can cue by saying, I was thinking. Or if it's your character, he or she was thinking. Once you use that, then you can say exactly what they're thinking, what's going on through their mind. Again, conflict will drive a story. So if they're thinking, hey, everything's great, it's a great day. That's not going to work. But they're thinking, oh man, maybe I should do this. On the other hand, maybe I should do that. It's that back and forth that's going to drive things. So now you see, well, external conflict takes place in the outer world. It's great for driving this sort of external dialogue. You can take the same sort of thing going on in the external world with the external conflict, the back and forth dialogue, and simply internalize it. Or instead of two characters, now you only have one character. The nice thing about internal dialogue is it simplifies things. You don't have to figure out which two people are involved. You can just use internal issues. And the great thing about that, particularly if you're doing a talk where you really have no other characters, it's something personally you did and you didn't interact with anybody else, you can use internal dialogue to describe how you felt and how you went back and forth in this decision, on this problem. So instead of having to create these two characters and what they're going to say back and forth, you just say, hey, do it inside. But it has to go back and forth. There has to be this conflict going on between I want to do something or maybe I don't, back and forth, because that's going to move the story forward. That's going to be the story. It's that conflict and growing that conflict that drives the story. So the internal conflict, which is internal dialogue, you move that story forward by building that conflict back and forth and back and forth. Well, now there's external conflict out there between two people. And there's internal conflict between two people. And you might think, Tim, that's it, right? I mean, there's like external, internal, and that's all there can be. But there's another type of conflict. It's not as widely used. It can be a little challenging to figure out exactly where to use. But it's different from external and internal conflict because of one major difference that completely sets it apart. All right. Now you have external conflict. Conflict out there between two people. Back and forth, back and forth. And that can drive conflict and drive a lot of doubt. Then you also have internal conflict, where it's just inside the person and they're kind of going back and forth and going a little crazy over, should I do this or should I do that? Back and forth they go. But there is another type of conflict. Another type of conflict completely different. Because it's different, it's a little more difficult to apply, but there's some special tricks you can use to make sure you can use it and use it effectively. And exploring this type of conflict can bring a whole new level to your story and to the conflict in your story. And that conflict is simply non-personal conflict. Non-personal conflict. In other words, it's a conflict that doesn't involve a person. That is, it's a conflict one person has, or somebody has, with something that's not a person. So whether you have external conflict between two people, internal conflict of one person between themselves, with non-personal conflict, it's one person and something that's not a person, and that sits with the conflict. The person by themselves will be fine until this non-personal thing comes along and creates the conflict. You may be wondering, well, what thing could be non-personal and create a conflict? I mean, conflicts are created by people. Well, not always. For instance, there are forces of nature. Forces of nature can be pretty major conflicts and create a lot of conflict to drive your story. For example, consider the Donner Party. Now, if you're not aware of the Donner Party, they were people many, many years ago who were trying to get through this mountain pass. The idea that they'd take this shortcut through the mountains and then they'd get to the other side and they'd be into the new world, the new land, and homesteaders and set up shop. Have their new great country place to live in. But a non-personal thing happens, I mean, completely outside of their control. It snowed. And it snowed. And it snowed. So left to themselves, they would have gotten through the pass just fine. No problem. They'd planned for it. They had enough food. No worries. But it snowed. And because of that, the snow acted as a non-personal thing that stopped them from doing stuff. It wasn't personal at all. It was not personal. But it still created a lot of conflict because they were trying to push through the snow. At the same time, the snow kept down, becoming more and more and more, making it more and more difficult for them to move at all. Created a lot of conflict. Maybe you're thinking, Tim, okay, great, you have this non-personal conflict. All right, not a person, but that means that dialogue goes right out the window. I mean, you can't have a dialogue anymore. Well, yes and no. You can't have an actual dialogue, but you can use the process of personifying the non-personal thing. That is, making the non-personal thing seem as if it's a human. And it's the simplest way to do that is say, it's as if. So for the example of the Donner Party, you can talk about the snow. You say it snowed and snowed and snowed. It's as if the snow was saying to the Donner Party, you're not getting through. And the more the Donner Party pushed through and struggled through that snow, as if they were saying, we're going to get through, the snow kept falling as if saying, no, you're not. So already you see there's a conflict, there's a dialogue back and forth, even though it's a non-personal conflict. You can use some form of personification to create this dialogue. Now, non-personal conflict may not be something that comes up as common as personal type conflicts, as external and internal, but it is a new level of conflict you can explore, figure out what to do with, and find a new level to build conflict into your story. If you're you're telling a story without conflict, you got a boring story. You need conflict to move that story forward and make sure that things happen. 3 simple conflicts you can use are internal conflict. That's external conflict first, actually. External conflict. Conflict outside between 2 people. This external conflict will create its own dialogue because one person wants something, the other person doesn't want them to get it. And as they argue and discuss it back and forth, that creates the conflict, that draws the dialogue. As in Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet want to get together, their parents are dead set against it. It's this external conflict that drives this external dialogue back and forth. This is Romeo saying, Dad, I really want to get together with Juliet. Dad saying, Romeo, can't do it. She's the wrong girl for you. Back and forth it goes. It's a simple, powerful conflict used a lot. So because 2 people arguing opposite points is pretty common in life and very easy to recognize. There's another type of personal conflict aside from external conflict is internal conflict. The opposite of external conflict. This conflict takes place inside the person, where the person has both sides represented. For example, if Romeo thought that his dad had a good point, he might be going back and forth. He might be thinking, oh, Juliet's so wonderful, I really should be with her. But then again, Dad's right. I mean, I don't want to bust up the whole family. This would be a horrible thing. Well, but Juliet, I mean, it's all right. I'm young. If it's a mistake, I can get over it. Yeah, but if it's a mistake, be many, many years will be suffering with this mistake. Back and forth it goes. Internal conflict, that internal dialogue, going back and forth and back and forth. That's powerful stuff. However, these are all personal types of conflict. You can use a third type of conflict, non-personal conflict. This is a case where you have a person who has something non-personal that opposes them and causes problems. For instance, like with the Donner Party. The Donner Party wanted to get through a pass, and it snowed and snowed and prevented them from getting through. Left to themselves, the Donner Party had no problem. Just get right through the pass. But with the snow coming down harder and harder and harder and harder, this created a real conflict. So that snow created the conflict, made the conflict happen. But if you're thinking, oh gee Tim, but that means you can't have dialogue. I mean, you deal with the non-personal things. You can personify that thing by saying something like, it's as if it was saying. It's as if it was saying, and then say what you think snow might be saying to the Donner Party. And this will create a dialogue that'll make everything to a little different level. Because dialogue really drives your story. The challenge of any story you tell is creating conflict. How do you create the right conflict? How do you make sure it's an interesting conflict that's going to move the story forward and make sure that things happen? Well, simple way is by dealing with these 3 types of conflict. Internal, external, internal, and non-personal. When you have these 3 types of conflict and you use them in layers, you start layering them. So you may have an external conflict going on out there, and the person may say, hey, that's a good point. They may internalize that conflict and say, gee, do I really want to do this? Or maybe I don't want to do this. And then maybe something else could happen aside from that. Something non-personal can create a conflict. Like if someone's having a really bad day. They got all this concerns and worries inside them, and then all of a sudden as they're walking outside, you're done with their umbrella and it just pours down rain. See, it's as if the rain was saying to them, hey, you think your day's bad? Can't get worse? Well, you're wrong. Now it's going to get worse. You can add on a non-personal conflict to really boost up that level of conflict. And you start exploring, layering these different levels of conflict in your story, you can discover that even a simple, basic tale of just what happened in your life or in somebody else's life is really interesting by using these 3 levels of conflict.